So I went to the Governor's Awards and I saw you hanging out with Lily and with Rachel. And I was thinking about the wonderful group of older women who are coming up this year. We have Charlotte Rampling and Maggie Smith
Helen
and Blythe
Mirren.
Danner, right? And it feels like, at least this year, there's more interest in that subject and in the subject of interesting older people than usual.
Let's hope it's the beginning of a trend and not just a one-off.
Well, this is something you've been paying some attention to. Often older characters are just ignored, and now they're interesting.
Yes, older women are the fastest growing demographic in the world, and so it's important that the powers that be that create the vehicles that create our consciousness, movie studios, television stations, start paying attention to us. When I was 48, I wrote a book called Women Coming of Age, and in it I said, among other things, that one of the things that was on my bucket list was giving a face to older women. And then I left the business for 15 years, and I thought, well, I guess that's one thing I'm not going to do. And I didn't expect what has happened, which is that I came back at 65, and that right now I'm doing a TV series about being older, both for men and women, and I feel wonderful about that. And I feel wonderful that people are talking about the problem of the absence of women in general, older women in particular.
You and Lily are fabulous in that show.
Oh, thank you.
That is the show you're
so
referring to, right?
Yes,
yeah.
Grace and Frankie.
Yeah,
for Netflix.
Grace and Frankie. I love that. So this character in Youth, Brenda Morell, is a hoot, and I wondered how much. And I'm sure everyone's asking you the same thing, but I can't help it. You are a major movie star. Is there a part of her in you?
Well, I think there's a part of oneself in every role that an actor plays. You know, you draw somewhere from who you are. And I grew up with Barbara Stanwyck and Betty Davis and Lucille Ball and those great icons around because they were my father's friends. And I think Barbara Stanwyck in particular was kind of in my DNA when I went to play Brenda. I didn't think about it consciously, but as I think back on it, those women and their feistiness were hovering around me when I played Brenda.
Well, she is someone who speaks up for herself and does so in this amazing 6-minute scene. It's just a bravura delivery that you have, and I understand that Sorrentino gave you the time to really nail it. Explain how you shot the scene.
There was no rehearsal. I'm sure you've heard this from the other actors in the film. He never said how he wanted it. It's a scene between me and Harvey Keitel, just the two of us. And, you know, you imagine, because of the way it's written, how it's supposed to be. And so we began with the camera. It was a 2-shot. And we played it the way we had rehearsed together, he and I, but not for Paolo. And so we played the scene. And he then did it again. And then he said, okay, now this time, ratchet it up. Make it more angry, more intense. And then we did that, and then he'd say, okay, now make it much more sotto voce. He was like a conductor. And so he had us doing it many, many different ways. As he moved the camera around over the shoulder, from across the ballroom, and all different angles, he would have us do it in many different ways, and then he edited it together the way he saw fit.
And what did you think of it when you saw it?
I don't know how to describe it. It kind of took me aback, actually. I mean, I was a little bit surprised by it, frankly, because he he used some of the sotto voce, and then he used some of the most heated, and kind of put them together. That's interesting. But he's the maestro, so
Well,
I bow to him.
well, to compare him to some of the other directors, where does he fall in the pantheon?
Well, his visions are different than anybody I have ever worked with. Maybe it's something in the water of Italy that brings the Fellinis and the Antonionis and the Paolo Sorrentinos to the surface. This surrealism, this kind of dreamy quality to it. And all his movies, Il Divo, which is my favorite, and The Great Beauty, for which he won an Oscar, and this one, they're all about very different things with very different textures, but they all have a dreamy quality to them, that kind of surrealism that Fellini and Antonioni had. That's what I find, that's what I wanted to work with. I've never worked with a director like that before. And it all has to do with how he edits and what he chooses to film. So when you're there as the actor on the day, in the moment, you don't feel, wow, this is really dreamy and surrealistic. Although I must say, when he took his camera all the way down to the other end of the ballroom and filmed us, you could hardly see us at the other end with a ping pong table between us, I thought, well, that's different. But it's not until you see the whole thing put together that you realize it's got a different flavor, it's got a different tempo than any other film that I've ever done with any other director. Fred Zinnemann, who directed me in Julia, we never rehearsed, hardly at all, and he gave very little direction. Hal Ashby gave very, very little direction. He directed me in Coming Home, but he would do 40 takes and print them all. And this was film. It was expensive. I was one of the producers. And so he came from the world of editing, and so he would create his movie by sculpting it with all the moments from all the different prints that he'd made. Each one is different. That's what's so great about being an actor. You're a puppet, and the puppeteers are all different, and they move you in a different way, and you get sore in different emotional muscles, and I like that. But I've never worked with anyone like Paolo before.
So is there a part of you that misses 35 millimeter filmmaking in this digital world that we're in? Or have you just adapted to it?
There's a lot of advantages to digital. It's much easier to sort of say, let me just do that line over again. I'm on a TV series now for Netflix called Grace and Frankie, and it's fascinating because it's digital. And so the rushes, the dailies that you see the next day, which I watch, a lot of actors don't, but I watch, there's a lot of them because you can kind of just let it go on and on and on. And you get, it's a lot of stuff that you watch when you want to catch up on what was done the day before. Whereas in the days of film, they would be very judicious on what they'd print. So there wasn't as much, to watch or choose from. But I kind of like digital. It all depends on what camera you're using and who the DP is.
So a lot of women have been complaining, and this came up, of course, at the Governor's Awards too, and we can see that there's been a kind of shift in the zeitgeist in terms of the vocal complaining. The women are coming out, and they're saying what's been true for a very long time, but was never spoken. Was there restraint until now, sheerly a question of having to play a certain role and never questioning authority, or being afraid that they would lose jobs if they were perceived as difficult?
Fear. Being an actor is not like being a musician. You have an instrument. You're not alone. And you can play by yourself for anyone. Being a painter, it's a solitary thing. You have a paint and a canvas. We have ourselves, our emotions, our heart, our degree of empathy in our bodies. And we can't do anything with it in terms of television or film unless there's this whole crew and someone at the head of it all saying yes or no. So we're very, very, it's a collaborative, and we're very, very dependent on our editors, the directors, the studio heads. So it can get scary, because if you become difficult and they don't like you, and they think you're a troublemaker, you just don't get work.
You've been through this.
And so, yeah, there is a certain amount of fear that kept our mouths shut. But there was also, until the women's movement made us understand that we weren't insane, that it was just simply wrong the way things were, we didn't even know,
But how crazy, you and I both went through the women's movement when it was happening. How crazy that it hasn't gotten better 30 years hence.
Well, whenever it comes to money, it's always going to be slower. Money and power. You can change a lot of things, but I'll tell you things that have changed. There are so many more women in the crew.
I'm glad to hear that.
Oh my gosh. I never ever saw women in the crew. Half of our crew is women on Grace and Frankie, and next season half of our directors are going to be women.
More true in television than film.
Much more true, and in documentaries. Why? Because they're not as expensive.
Correct.
When you have studios only make movies now that are tentpole movies, that are hundreds of millions of dollars, that they're pretty sure, because they're part of a franchise, will make money. And when they don't, it is a catastrophe, and their jobs are on the line. So what do we do when we're in a scary and secure place? We go to what's familiar. They're all white male, for the most part. They go to white male to...
But even the women do, too.
And what's interesting is you can have a woman who's directed a high-budget movie, and then you can have a man who never has, and he'll be the one that'll be hired to direct a big tentpole franchise, because that makes them feel comfortable. And the only way to change the studio part is to shame them into changing it. And so I think, you can't solve a problem until you've named it and are talking about it. And that's happened now. So I think, I think that it will begin to change. The head of the Academy, the Motion Picture Academy of Arts and Sciences, the other night at the Governor's Award, just explicitly said we have to join together in an effort to create diversity along gender, along race, along all kinds of lines.
Well, you were an early pioneer in being vocal about having to produce your own movies in order to get the roles you wanted to play.
Well, that makes me laugh.
Successful as a result.
That makes me laugh, because there was a whole generation before me of women who produced their own movies and ran studios. Well, I've just drawn a complete blank now, but there were many of them who were very, very powerful women who produced, and then it tapered off when the studio system ended. And I was one of the first to come back, because I had a very specific reason for wanting to make movies. There were things, it was the 60s and 70s.
You had things you wanted to say.
I had things that I wanted to say, and I didn't want to make the kind of movies that people were offering me anymore, so I thought, well, I'll just create my own. And I got a partner, Bruce Gilbert, to do it with me, and a lot of them were very successful. And some of them I did it, Coming Home, that was with Jerry Hellman. China Syndrome, that was with Michael Douglas. 9 to 5, that was just me and Bruce.
A lot of ripped from the headlines stuff.
Yeah.
That was good.
And it worked, because we realized, we're sending a message, so we have to couch it in a genre. Coming Home was a love story. China Syndrome was a thriller. 9 to 5 was a comedy. So that even if you didn't agree with what the message was, you'd want to see it, just because it was a good movie within that genre.
I think the thing that makes me crazy is even, not hiring women directors or whatever, that whole issue I understand, we've discussed, but even the content, when you have the statistics showing how many of these films have always done well. Mm-hmm. It's as if Bridesmaids comes out and it's like, oh, look, this movie made money. It should not be a surprise.
Yeah, right.
The statistics are there.
I'm optimistic.
I'm glad to hear it.
Yes.
Thank you.
I hope I'm around to see it.
You will be.